Most of you all, just as a quick overview, know us at Ideal. We're more or less here to support BHA in a number of capacity needs. We have folks on the line today from that under Ideal that are Save the Children, the Kaizen Company, Mercy Corps, and Tango International. We're happy to answer more questions later, but the purpose of today is the target setting, so I'm just going to move us right past our Ideal overview slide because we worked so closely with you three. On your registration for this event, we asked you to list out the first 3 words you think of when you think of target setting. And this is a word cloud of those responses. When I saw this yesterday, I was really shocked with just how practical and technical all of your feedback was for this. I shouldn't have been shocked because we're all very technical people, I feel, in the M&E sphere. But the most cited words are those that are largest. So beneficiaries, numbers, achievable, achievements, targets, very discrete, actionable items around target setting. I was also very encouraged to not see things like scared or overwhelmed or don't know. And further down, I like that we're seeing concepts around calculation and verification and achievements. But in a synopsis, it was really nice to see how technically each of you are addressing this topic. And I think it's going to lead to a really productive session today and tomorrow. So with that overview on tech, I'm going to now take a step back and hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Diana Cayley from BHA, who is going to lead us through these sessions today. And she's got some great slides in front of us. So Diana, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. My name is Diana Cayley. I am a member of the BHA M&E team here in Washington, D.C. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and thank you to Lloyd and the Ideal team for getting us set up today. And especially thank you to our translators. Again, if anyone has issues with translation, please just drop that in the chat and we'll make sure that you get covered. So today, we're going to talk about a really important topic to our DFSAs, which is the process of setting and revising targets, both for participant-based indicators and population-based indicators. So today on day 1, we will start by talking about the linkages between those 2 types of indicators. Then when over the course of the life cycle of a DFSA, we would want to sort of engage in that process of setting or revising targets. Then we will move to discuss the intersection between activity design and the process of setting targets. Then we'll finish today by talking about what makes sort of sound or good participant level targets. And then tomorrow we will spend a bit more time talking about the sort of art and science behind what we call objective target setting. And I'm using the quotes around objective because it's not completely objective. There is a combination of some math involved, which we will cover conceptually, but not necessarily get too deep into tomorrow. But really focusing on where the Malawi and Madagascar partners are in the activity life cycle to understand the process by which we would set targets for these participant-based and population-based indicators. And then we will finish day 2 by breaking out into smaller groups where we will discuss different case studies around and sort of practical application of the things we will have discussed today and tomorrow in the first part of the session. So with that, I'll go ahead and move to the next slide. Great, thanks. So it's worth pulling back and thinking, you can stay on that slide, that's okay. It's worth pulling back and thinking about the big picture of a DFSA, essentially. So let me first start by inviting folks to unmute themselves if they like, and answer the question, why do we establish targets on these types of activity? You can go to the next slide, the trees. Thanks. So if you want to raise your hand or an unmute, can anyone, or you can put in the chat if you prefer, why do we go through the process of establishing targets on a DFSA? Great. James says to measure our achievements. Exactly. That's one purpose. Can anyone else think of anything? Cara says to measure integration across sectors. Also very good. We have for learning, to ensure value for money. These are all great answers. Thank you. Keep them coming. Accountability, great. Make sure we reach the most vulnerable people. Excellent. So these are all, and continue to keep adding things to set realistic targets. Great. Thanks, Tosa. So yeah, so there's really a lot of important functions around this process of establishing targets, but some of you touched on it. It's about accountability, transparency. It allows us to set benchmarks against which we can monitor progress. It also supports adaptive management. So over the course of a 5-year or more than 5-year life cycle, if we haven't set initial benchmarks of where we would like to be, it's hard to sort of support that adaptive management process. So those are really important sort of big picture concepts for us to have in mind as we go into thinking about setting and revising targets. Next slide, please. So I like to use this slide to introduce the concept of the 2 different types of indicators that we might see in a DFSA. So we have here, you see that the bookend, baseline, endline indicators, and our sampling frame for those is going to be population based or population level. So ultimately the objective of a FFP funded or now BHA funded DFSA is to affect population level change. So the function of the baseline and endline indicators is to look at the entire population in the area of implementation. By what magnitude will we have seen and measured change over the course of the award life cycle? And then separately from that, we have the annual monitoring indicators, which are going to be participant level or participant based. So I use the icon here, it's like checking a pulse. We're able to sort of tap into and monitor those participant level indicators on a regular, either rolling, annual, or biannual basis, depending on the indicator and the sector, in order to sort of establish where we are in that process. Next slide, please. So this will come as second nature to all of my M&E colleagues on the call today, but it may not necessarily be as intuitive for other technical team members. But there's really a different process by which we can think about establishing and setting targets for output indicators versus outcome indicators. So typically, outputs are collected through routine monitoring, for example, number of people trained. These often include new and continuing disaggregates. So again, for training, you might train the same people over and over again. And you also might bring new people on. Outputs often have a 0 base value. And by base value, that refers to annual monitoring indicators where there isn't some pre-established value that we might draw on against which we can compare by the end of the activity. Typically, outputs are also directly attributable to the intervention or the activity. And almost always, outputs refer only to participant level indicators. So for those reasons, it can be fairly straightforward to establish output targets. By contrast, further up from outputs are the outcomes, or the sort of things that will result from us having achieved those outputs. Those are typically collected through surveys, though not always. Sometimes those can be through different methods, of course. These often measure the cumulative effect of the intervention over time, although again, not always, it depends. We often, but not always, see a non-zero base value. So for example, if we're thinking about breastfeeding rates, for example, typically we're not going to see a base value of 0. We'll have some pre-established value, and then from there we'll be sort of seeing changes. And finally, outcomes, the attribution is a little bit more tricky. And so when thinking about outcomes or outcome indicators, our sampling frame or the groups from which we will draw the information or data can either be participant level if it's an annual monitoring indicator, or population level if it's a baseline endline indicator. So it's important for us to keep in mind that the beginning of a DFSA life cycle, when we're planning activities and looking at a DIP or the detailed implementation plan, it's very straightforward to align a DIP against output indicators. It's much more tricky to establish what are realistic outcome indicators. So we hope that by engaging with you all today and through your engagements with Justin and Killian, it'll become clear how we can establish those good outcome indicators. Okay, so next slide, and let's pull up the pop quiz. So you should see on your screen in just a moment a question. So go ahead and take a moment to read this, to do a quick test of your knowledge about what constitutes an output versus an outcome indicator. So go ahead and click on the answer that you think is right, and then we'll wait about 30 seconds and then pull up the results of the survey and see how people do. All right, let's go ahead and pull those results up and take a look. Great, so folks said indicate if the indicator is an output or outcome, yield as an outcome indicator, good, number of farmers trained, output, and then number 3, indicate if the indicator is an so percent of goats, oops, great, vaccinated. Great, okay, you wanna go ahead and show the answers on the slide, Laura? Great. Yeah, so great job, everyone. Yes, that was a little bit of a trick question at the end there, but typically yield is going to be an outcome indicator. Typically, number of farmers trained will be an output indicator, assuming that we are directly training individuals through the activity. But the percent of goats vaccinated, this is a trick question. It could be, depending on where it is in the causal model or the theory of change. If the activity is directly doing the vaccination, then that would be considered an output. However, if we're training farmers and veterinary service providers to do vaccinations, and we hope to see the percent of goats vaccinated higher up that causal chain, then we would consider that indicator as an outcome indicator. So it's, again, it can depend on the indicator whether we treat it as an output or an outcome, and that will be contingent on the design of the activity. So we can go ahead and close that poll and move to the next slide. Great, so sort of pulling back and thinking, there's several points at which implementing partners will set and revise their targets. And so typically we think of a DFSA life cycle. There's a pre-award stage where NGO partners will put a lot of work and thought into the design and establishing some preliminary targets. Then the R&I year, or refine and implement year, where you all are now, you're in the process of reviewing what's happening, those preliminary results from those refinement studies or pilots. And then each year annually, there's the opportunity to update. So go ahead to the next slide, please. Great. So we see at different points in the life cycle of the award, we're doing the preliminary target setting at the proposal stage, and then that second little bullet, or that second little explosion there under right after baseline, the idea is that you'll be looking again at those baseline and endline targets and changing any ones that were submitted at the proposal that maybe don't make sense based on the activity design and theory of change now. And then as you move forward on an annual basis, either through the ARR or annual results report process each November, or during the PREP submission each year. And the PREP is an acronym that we use that stands for essentially the budget request each year, where partners submit the activity design for the forthcoming year and a request for budget. So if there are anticipated changes, those are opportunities on an annual basis when we would see changes. And then also you might see between years 3 and 4, typically, after following a midterm evaluation, we would ask partners to think about and revisit some of those annual and endline targets to see if there are any changes needed to the activity and how those might translate into changes in targets. Next slide, please. Great, so I'll invite you all to open up your chats again or unmute yourself if you like. But I want to sort of pivot gears here and think about what's the relationship between those population level targets and the participant level targets. Can we unmute Leah?
So actually, participant level targets will contribute to the population level targets.
Great, excellent. Thank you for that. Yeah,
Participants are the part of the whole population.
exactly. Great. Rafiq saying to measure overall changes in population and measure direct participant levels. Good. We have also looking at different targeted zones. That's right. Any other contributions? Yes, participants are nested in the population. Thanks, ideal. And then they live in the same area. That's also true. Great. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So really, sort of, this is a conceptual model of a theory of change that instead of being in 3 separate Excel sheets, it's in one that we've changed graphically. But essentially, how you can read this or observe this is that out on the peripheries, we see the individual outputs or the result of direct interventions with the objective of achieving that goal that's in the center. So maybe improving food security and nutrition outcomes might be an example of a high-level goal. So really what we aim to do by setting targets is establishing how might we think about achieving results at the periphery that will then feed into the achievement of those high-level results in the middle there. And as our colleagues noted in the chat, there is a direct connection between what we do with participants at the periphery and then how we might be measuring that at the population level by the end of the activity. So next slide, please. So I'll give you a second to take in this slide, but this is showing a possible causal link between some indicators that we might think about or some sort of concepts and an outcome we might be interested in. So here we have maternal diet, breastfeeding, incidence of diarrhea among children under 5, hand washing behaviors, and diet diversity. So we see sort of conceptually and in that theory of change or log frame, these would be the sort of places, things that we might be working on to achieve this high level result of the prevalence of stunting. So essentially where your DFSAs are now is focused more on maybe these setting these targets for the indicators in blue here, like MAD or breastfeeding, but with the acknowledgement that you'll be soon ready to establish those population level targets, such as prevalence of stunting. So we'll focus more on that sort of mathematical part and conceptual part of that tomorrow. But today we really want to sort of focus on the fact that these are connected. And then next slide, please. That we also need to think about the magnitude of those changes. So here, say I was an M&E advisor looking at an IPTT that was causally linking these things together. So take a moment and read and think about what you might observe in these numbers here. So 20% MAD, 40% breastfeeding as an end line or an LOA target for those population level indicators. Do those seem about right, or would you suggest things that are maybe different? And go ahead and add that to the chat, any thoughts you have on this. Poor result to a 6 percentage point reduction, says Rafiq, good. Do these seem like the right indicators that might lead to reductions in stunting? Are we missing other things maybe? Great, any other comments from folks in the chat? Feel free to comment. Good, James says we are missing improved services. James, what kind of services are you thinking about here? And feel free to unmute if you like, James.
Oh, like for instance, like service provided by the local Ministry of Health, for instance, in certain diseases and things of that nature.
Great.
So this might have something to do, you know, especially if you have children who are malnourished and they're not getting treated properly or effectively. So all of these other things, they may improve, but then without that other piece, you might not receive that 6% reduction.
Exactly, great. So this is some of the indicators that we might track, but there's also other aspects, including the quality of service delivery, which may not necessarily be something that's easily quantifiable to monitor over time. And it may be something that's outside the control or the manageable interest of the partner, but is worth monitoring and tracking as a contextual indicator, whether that is something that we monitor qualitatively or quantitatively. Those are things for us to sort of keep in mind. We also see it's realistic if there's an annual reduction. It's missing access to safe water. That's a great point. Of course, for looking at nutrition outcomes, safe water is really important. Leah is raising her hand also. Go ahead, Leah.
So we just have here the maternal adequate diet and executive breastfeeding, but we're talking about the stunting reduction in children under 5. So we also the adequate child's diets.
Yes. So we're not even looking at the child diet. We're only looking at the moms, and it's children under 5, not infants, right? Great point. Okay. We also have, we would want to add one on complementary feeding and then, yeah, MAD for children. Great. So does anyone have any thoughts on the numbers we've included here? 20% MAD for women, 85% diarrhea. Do those seem about right to you to achieve a 6 percentage point reduction? Joseph's sharing that 85% diarrhea in past 2 weeks seems not realistic. It actually, that's a real number we've seen on DFSAs before. So it just depends on the area. Diarrhea is too high. Yes, so as a target, yes, you're right. So it may be something we would see in a baseline survey or a base value, but as a target, that seems very high. Any other comments on any of these indicator targets for participant-based? I think everyone's in agreement that the diarrhea target is far too high. Why are folks saying that the diarrhea target is too high? What's the connection between that? It does depend on the area, that's true. How are we drawing a causal link between that CU5 diarrhea indicator and the CU5 stunting indicator? I think instinctively we know it's too high, but okay, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So generally speaking, I put these numbers in here intentionally so that they would sort of bowl you over with how off they were. In order to achieve a 6 percentage point reduction in stunting, which is a very, high level indicator from a causal standpoint. And as James was noting, and many of you were noting, there's a lot of other things that would be happening and that we might be seeing in our theory of change that can have a detrimental effect on stunting. So it may be that even if we achieve ambitious results in the set of indicators that we are tracking, there's a lot of other things that could go on, but it speaks to the need to set realistic and ambitious targets among our participant cohort so that we will see it translate into high-level results at the population level. So generally, we're saying, all of you noted, yes, the target for diarrhea is much too high, and we might say that the hand washing behavior, for example, is too low. We'd want to see a much higher adoption rate for there. So it's important to sort of think about the relationship between those. And one of the things I'd like to underscore here is that I'm posing figures here, I'm posing numbers in this slide. And one of the things that we'll talk about tomorrow and then in subsequent engagements with you all going forward is our ability to actually assign a mathematical connection between these two. And we'll sort of walk through that process tomorrow, but you all had the right instinct, which is that the magnitude matters, but that really we want to move our DFSA partners from sort of like looking at things and eyeballing them and saying, I think this maybe is too low or too high, but really assigning numeric values for the indicators that we can do that for, not all of them. But we'll get more into why objective target setting is a really powerful tool in the process of target setting. So let's move to the next slide. And so we have a little tea break built in. So those that want to take a short break, take a health break if you need to. And then we'll invite those of you that want to stay engaged and stay online to toggle over to the Google Doc and provide any thoughts or insights you have on the following question. How might we monitor progress toward improvements or not improvements, depending on the context, in child nutrition status? And so we will be back ready to go on the hour in 7 minutes. So go ahead and take that time. If you need to urgently check your email and open that up, Just make sure you close it out before you come back, and we'll see you in 7 minutes. Thanks so much, everyone. And if you have questions in the meantime, please feel free to unmute and ask, or put them into the chat, and we'll make sure that we have a chance to engage with you. Thanks. So thank you so much, everyone. I hope you had a nice, relaxing break. It got to open and then close out your email if you were checking those. So I thought I would start by visiting this question that many of you filled out during the tea break. Thanks to those who did. And quickly reflect on it. So those who are not already there, if you want to toggle to the Google Doc. So the question we posed was, how might we monitor progress toward improvements in child nutrition status? So we see a lot of folks answering with growth monitoring, looking at anthropometrics, behavior change, and some other observation methods. So looking at, visits to the health facility, looking at numbers of children receiving supplemental or therapeutic foods, or participation in a program that would do that. And one person here says postnatal care, immunization rates, exclusive breastfeeding, complementary feeding, access to health services, child care behavior, nutritional diet, and growth monitoring. So that's really great. I thought Killian and I were chatting during the break about how there is a heavy focus in the answers here on growth monitoring, which, yes, is very important, that we want to keep a direct line of sight on that particular outcome and use a monitoring approach that will directly focus on that one outcome. But what we really would like to also instill in folks is this wider aperture or wider view of all of the other aspects. Like this person here, it's starting with this long line here at the bottom of looking at what are all the other things, whether it's a context indicator, like it may not be that the activity is doing immunizations as an outcome or an output of the activity, but it may very directly be relevant for monitoring improvements in child nutrition status. So we're encouraging DFSAs as you go through the process of thinking about setting targets and creating your IPTT and your log frame, where you're thinking about what are also indicators that maybe don't have a target that you'll be achieving as a DFSA, but that are equally important to the achievement of your targets. So one of those examples that someone raised here may be something like immunization. One thing I thought was very interesting is that I didn't see, at least not that I'm reading through and I'm scanning it now, any qualitative approaches to monitoring. So maybe something like childcare behavior might be something we could monitor qualitatively, but that's another thing we'd like to make sure folks are thinking about when they're designing their M&E systems. And it's something that we would like to sort of draw attention to from the technical side as well, that sort of using those quantitative indicators along with qualitative monitoring approaches can really help us gain a fuller picture of the progress. If you remember that theory of change model, as we move from the peripheries where we do the direct intervention into that sort of middle goal that we would have on a DFSA, qualitative approaches can be very important to help us monitor and track progress, especially in areas that are not easily quantifiable through either routine monitoring or survey methods. So thank you so much again for everyone's contributions to this question. And with that, we'll go ahead and move into the next slide. Excellent. So before we talked about the connection between participant level indicators and targets with population level targets. And now we're going to spend a few minutes, well, the remainder of today's session really, on thinking just about the connection between the activity design or intervention and the participant level targets that we would want to set, and then again, revise over the course of the DFSA. Next slide, please. So, and you'll notice I use the slide here with the trees in it because this is really a question that's meant to sort of pull back from any individual tree and for us to think about the forest. So let me pose anyone who'd like to unmute or contribute via the chat. Why are we setting or establishing participant level targets on a DFSA, and why specifically is it so important in the life cycle of your individual DFSA to do this process well right now? So again, feel free to raise your hand through the app, or through the Zoom, or go ahead and add it to the chat box. So maybe I'll specifically call on our technical team leads. Say you're the WASH manager or the health systems strengthening manager. Why would this be very important for you to understand what's happening among your participant group? Gadesi says every participant is unique and has different needs. Yes, that's definitely true. Maybe I'll pose the question a different way. Many of you on the call with us today are certainly not new to this industry or to your profession. Maybe you want to give an example of some time in a previous role that you've played or in your current role where you have seen things go off the rails with an activity where where there was underperformance or maybe overperformance. You know, what happened and how might it have mattered to have set targets? How did you know when things were going as they should not have been? And then we hear, yes, to reach targeted people in real need and ensure that resources can cover all the activities related to those needs. Yes, that's great. Oh, and Rafiq says participant level changes and spillover together will tell you changes in the population. Yes, that's great. So that's the connection again between those two different types of indicators. So would someone like to share an example of where they've maybe been part of a team where there was maybe over or under performance, and how did you use participant level targets to understand what your progress was like, either over or under? And Gift says you will need to track changes happening on this participant. This will show the changes in the wider group. Great, thank you. So maybe I'll share an example from my experience. 10 years ago, I was working on a USAID funded program with an NGO in Iraq. And we had, it was an $89 million, so very large program. And we had targets that were set for each of the different purposes of our activity. We had a small grants program, we had a war victims fund program, we had a small infrastructure program, and then we had a youth development program. And in the early stages of the activity, we were way above target on all of our direct training and working with young people and our small grants program, but all the infrastructure investments that we were making were flagging and falling far shorter than we thought. So it was a very useful tool for me as I was leading the quarterly and annual work planning process to see and measure against where we thought we were going to be at the end of each year or even each quarter, and then make some critical decisions about reallocating staff time and resources to address what we saw were performance issues. And importantly, also, we had the ability to send staff out to the field and really understand why it was that we were over or underperforming in various aspects of the program. And it allowed us to achieve far greater results by the end of the activity at the end of the 5th year. And we actually got an extension on the activity because we had done a nice job of sort of mixing those qualitative and quantitative approaches to monitor. And we used, a very careful system of checking those participant-based targets on a quarterly and even monthly basis. So we were really able to sort of track how we were investing our time and resources as an activity. So essentially, setting and using participant level targets achieves these same objectives or similar ones that we talked about before, which is accountability, transparency. It allows us to benchmark and monitor progress. And then probably most importantly, in my mind, is that it supports adaptive management, which is a process that involves, the M&E team, the learning lead, the chief of party and senior leadership, as well as all the technical team members and home office support team members as well. So it's really a really important way for us to anchor those conversations around decisions around adaptive management. Great. Oh, we have some more questions here, or we have some more comments here in the chat. We need participant level information. Project capacities are important. There's financial aspects of it as well, and behavior change. Great. These are all great contributions. Thank you so much. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So it's pretty much a given that in any given activity that USAID supports, it's impossible for us to target all households or individuals or communities in a particular area. So it forces us to be strategic about the identification process of who we will work with to best leverage that reach beyond just the number of people that we are directly engaged with. So someone had mentioned in the chat earlier the importance of secondary adoption. And this is really an important aspect of activity design, and also has important implications for the process of setting and revising targets. Of course, secondary adoption rates, or if there's tier 1 and tier 2 participants, for example, it may not necessarily make sense or be possible for all types of interventions. For example, if you're doing a seed distribution with improved seed varieties, it may not be possible that we would see any kind of secondary adoption right away from that, as opposed to something that's more a social behavior change intervention where we've really designed it in such a way as to target the primary group, who will then, translate that behavior, have a ripple effect into a secondary or tier 2 group. So here we see on the slide an example of what we might have on a DFSA that is looking at breastfeeding or child nutrition and maternal nutrition status. So in this example, we might find from our population-based survey at the baseline that we have only about 30% breastfeeding. So let's say about 3 in 10 women would be actively breastfeeding in that 12 months after. So our goal for most USAID funded activities that will be monitoring progress toward breastfeeding, we generally take the approach that we would like to achieve an 80% rate of exclusive breastfeeding by the end of the activity. That's a pretty big difference, and this is not an uncommon result. Many of the DFSAs that I have worked on at Food for Peace started with breastfeeding rates that were in the 30s or 40s in the beginning of the activity. So that's a pretty intense change. And also the cohort of women and families who we might work with in year 1 or 2 may not necessarily be the same people that we would be surveying again and that would be breastfeeding in year 5 when the end line is done. So there's also a sort of changeover that's interesting and can be difficult for us to think about, which we'll talk about more tomorrow. So in this example, the activity design team and technical team members may decide that we will take an approach of targeting a specific group for an intensive type of training or social behavior change programming, with the idea that then those individuals will then spread the messaging and result in what we would call secondary adoption of the key behavior that we are interested in learning about, or sorry, monitoring, which in this case is exclusive breastfeeding. Next slide, please. So here, I'll give you a second to take a look at this. It's a lot of arrows on there. So really what we would be thinking about is this sort of direct and indirect adoption of the behavior. And we put some thoughts in here on the approaches we might use to monitor that. So we would be able to use survey methods through participant-based survey methods to only look at that, capture what's happening in our group of participants. And it may be that in that non-participant group, those last 4 women there at the end, we may not necessarily be capturing those individuals through our participant-based survey methods because they're not actually participants. So this might be an opportunity for us to use qualitative monitoring to see, are there changes, but we may not necessarily be able to assign quantitative values for that secondary group, which again is going back to the question we posed over the break, why it's important for us to sort of think about how those fit together. So there's a note here at the bottom, just a reminder, it's really important to design for secondary adoption and to account for that secondary adoption, both in the geographic and geographic targeting, household or individual selection process, and then the specific targeting of where the interventions will be rolled out and the design. And again, this is going to be very different depending on each sector and even each outcome within those sectors. So again, it's an important consideration for us to have going forward. Are there any questions or comments? What do you think about this type of approach? Are there aspects of it that you think are missing, or things that you would do differently, or that you have done differently on projects that had breastfeeding as an outcome? Go ahead and raise your hand, or add any kind of comments to the chat. Rafiq's asking to repeat the question. Thanks, Rafiq. So my question is, does this, maybe we can go back one slide. Yes, thank you. Does this approach of using secondary adoption to improve, to sort of have a greater magnitude of impact at the population level, does this seem like something that the DFSAs would undertake? Is this a design aspect that you think would work? Why or why not? Great. Fahim, go ahead and unmute.
Thank you. I'm trying still to understand the question, but from our experience, the secondary adoption targeting is probably a bit difficult to monitor at the population level.
Yes.
Even if it's collected at the baseline level and then done on the on the inline level to compare that results, but we still have to, it's an extended, I would say, beneficiaries or participants of the project that would make it difficult for the project team to monitor or achieve. I mean, based on our experience in the DFSAs.
Great, thank you for sharing that. That's a very great point. It's very challenging to monitor a population level change when we are primarily set up to observe changes at the participant level. So that's a difficult connection to make. And it speaks to the need to use sort of creative approaches, sometimes qualitative, where it's not going to tell us the same information than, say, we would have from a baseline and endline quantitative survey. So I think we have one other person who has raised their hand. Would you like to unmute and share? Idesi, it looks like you have your hand raised. Go ahead. And it looks like you're still on mute.
Yeah, it seems I had raised it accidentally, but anyway, it's somehow I feel like it might work, but then somewhere we might end up focusing our attention more on those that we're not practicing the behavior in the initial, during the baseline, looking at how diverse behaviors among us populations, among us people are. We might end up also not really targeting the ones that we thought in the initial phase were practicing breastfeeding, and they might end up slacking behind and would just be going around in the same circle. I think that's what I wanted to say. Thanks.
So what would you do in such a case if you find that happening on the activity?
I think previously in some of the other projects, we had also been targeting both those that have been participating and conducting the desired behavior that we would want them to, as well as the ones that would want to kind of like shift the norms and change their behavior so that they are in line with what is promoted for the optimum quality of care that they would want to. So targeting both, but then intensively for those areas where we knew that they had negative behaviors to what we wanted. Yeah.
Great. So maybe a better approach would have been to have this box here in the center of the screen, include those women that are already doing the behavior, and have that help our likelihood of a higher secondary adoption rate. Great. Thank you so much for that contribution. I appreciate that. Let's see, we have some chat comments. Cara says, I believe it can work, but will be complicated to track and measure. That's definitely true, especially if it's involving both participants and non-participants. Rado shares, yes, it's possible the approach of training change agents at the community level will target secondary adoption. Measurement's complicated. Yes, definitely. That's a theme that's coming out, certainly. Rafiq shares, yes, it will work. For example, DFSA capacity building to service providers, and they provide service both for participants and non-participants. Yes, great point. So when we're thinking about targeting, it may not just be individuals, but it might also be targeting the service providers also. And there's some sort of secondary effects there as well. And then we have project couldn't cover all the population level, then we'd need to see secondary adoption by participant level. Yes, great. Great contributions. Thank you all so much. Let's go ahead forward 2 slides. Great. So here we have a quick pop quiz. So this should be showing up on your screen as a quick quiz. So go ahead and take a moment to read this and then provide your answer. Or is this the Google Doc? Yeah, here we are. Okay. So for this one, you can answer either yes or no in the poll. And if you think it's other, go ahead and write into the chat what your answer would be. So far the results are, do we need maybe 1 more minute? How are folks doing? We have almost everyone. Okay, so good. So we have a couple of folks chiming in the chat here. The results were here. So half the folks said no. The other half were split between yes and other. So Laura, do you want to go ahead and show us the answer there? This was a trick question. So congratulations, those of you who said it was other and wrote in the chat. Rafiq and Rado both tell us there's not sufficient information there. We don't know, for example, the ratio of participants to population. So yes, very good. This was intended to be a trick question, so I apologize for that. But yes, it's important that we're thinking about the conceptual relationships, but there's also just the mathematical problem. I did not give you enough information here to look. So what this should mean is, and one of the things I often see as a member of the M&E team with USAID is in reports or status updates that we get from our partners is this mixing of progress on participant level change and tying it to the outcomes that they are anticipating by the end of the activity at the population level without giving sufficient information that's required for us to actually tie those two together. So I would like to caution everyone when we're thinking about monitoring performance against our benchmarks for participant, annual or biannual targets. That's one aspect. And then thinking about the connection to those end line targets at the population level, those are not a straight shot unless we have all the information required, which we will talk about more tomorrow. So that's a good question. Thanks to those of you who answered, and we'll go ahead to the next slide now. So thinking again about this annual monitoring process and setting and checking against participant level targets, it's a great place to start is with the requirements. So each year in the ARR process, or the annual results report process, we ask NGO partners to report both the status or progress to date and also provide updates on out year targets and LOA targets. So for example, say we have a training indicator and we are at the end of year 1 or year 2, we would report the results to date and then update the out year targets going forward. And then we would summarize those together into the LOA or life of award targets for those participant level indicators. We are also looking in the IPTT for the correct disaggregations. So for individual level indicators, it is a requirement by USAID as of 2011, and then reinforced again in 2016 under the USAID evaluation policy, that for every individual or person level indicator, we collect the gender of or sex of that person. So that's important to consider when we're thinking about target setting, we don't just want to establish targets for all individuals, but also for those age and sex disaggregates. And then for household level indicators, we are going to look at the type of household. So whether that's has an adult male and an adult female, maybe only adult male or only adult female, or in rare circumstances, we may be working with households that have no adults and only have children. And that would be depending on how that is defined in the local context. So it's important to note, I mentioned before that the IPTT and log frame may have context indicators. So for example, vaccination rate. It may not be something that's directly tied to the activity intervention, but it may be an important context indicator that the activity would like to keep track of and monitor to understand how it may affect the outcomes on the activity. So we ask that partners include those context indicators, but it's not necessary to include targets for those, because again, those are things that are not within the manageable interest of partner. However, if it is important from a monitoring standpoint to include figures in your IPTT and clearly differentiate, say for example, the host government is proposing a vaccination program, and that target of that program is a 90% vaccination rate in the area of implementation. And then you as an activity note that the program never achieved that result. It may be something that you would like to track, but we wouldn't expect that to be reported, for example, in your annual results report, because it's a context factor. Finally, for our participant level indicators, the first value that you will include in your IPTT is the base value. And I use the term base value here intentionally. So for our baseline endline indicators, those are population level, and we use the term baseline to conceptually differentiate between those population-based indicators and those initial baseline values. And then separately from that, we have our participant-based indicators, which we will report base values. So those base values can come from one of two places, essentially. Say it's a yield of a particular commodity, such as maize. It may be that the government, Ministry of Agriculture, or other NGOs who have been operating in that area already have reliable data that is able to be used by the partner to establish a base value. In your IPTT, you can include that as your base value, and then you would just include a note in the IPTT that this is where that data came from. In other cases, say you're doing a specific village savings and loan program that has never been undertaken in this area before. So you have no reference point for, say, the amount of savings over the course of a year per individual. Your base value wouldn't exist from the beginning of the activity, and it would be the first time you collected those data that would become your base value. So your base value and your year one, or even year two in some cases, values may be one and the same. And so Justin and Killian will be your go-to advisors on when you can sort of think about those two. But the reason I mention it here is that when we're thinking about a base value and the change, it may be important for us to consider the source of where that base value came from, to make a determination about what the target should be. And it may be that we have to change that over time because the base value we had initially doesn't necessarily make sense going forward. So I'll give an example. I am the primary advisor on our DFSA programs in DRC or Congo. And one of my partners used for their base value for their agricultural yields, national level figures for those commodities like maize and cowpeas and beans. And we found after the first farmer survey that the yields in the area of implementation were about half of what the national average was. So we discussed with our activity managers at the mission, and they said that this is typical for this region. So rather than setting the benchmark at the national standard, we worked with the partner to reset those values for the base at something that was more appropriate given the particular context that we were operating in. So we ended up changing those base values out in the second year of the activity so that it made more sense, and we would more accurately be able to determine changes over the course of the activity life cycle than if we had used an inaccurate, or not inaccurate, but not appropriate base value. So I think that's an important conversation for us to have as we're moving forward. Next slide, please. So I mentioned before, we use the term LOA, or Life of Award Targets. And again, this is specifically for those annual monitoring indicators, not for the end line baseline indicators. So the LOA targets for participant-based monitoring indicators can be updated annually, except in the final year of the award. They're typically established by doing one of two approaches. Either it's the sum of annual values, or it's equivalent to that final annual target. So for example, if I'm looking at ODF rates, or open defecation free, the number of villages, I don't necessarily care at the end of an activity what the rate was in year 2 or 3. So it wouldn't really make sense for me to add those percents up. So my end line, or my LOA target, would be the same as my 5th year target in that case. By contrast, if I want to observe the number of people I've trained each year, for example, I would want to add those annual targets to establish my LOA target. And you'll see the third bullet point here. Training would be an example of a non-cumulative LOA value. So say I'm looking at a year 3 IPTT and looking at a training indicator. What I have seen many times across many DFSAs is that partners will use the past targets and future targets to establish the LOA target, when in fact, what we would prefer, because it's more accurate, is to draw from your past actual values plus your future targets to establish those LOA targets. So for example, say a DFSA is intending to train 100 farmers in years 2, 3, 4, and 5, but we find ourselves in year 3 with only having achieved half of that the previous year. We would either want to lower the end line LOA value by drawing on the past actual, or we would want to draw on the past actual and then bump up the out year targets so we were still able to achieve our LOA value of 400 by the end of the activity. And of course, we want to the extent possible, we want to avoid double counting. This is going to be something that you can find advice on, specifically per indicator, how to avoid double counting in the indicator handbooks. So looking at the peers or the performance indicator reference sheet. Of course, we recognize that some indicators can be incredibly difficult to calculate and nearly impossible sometimes to avoid double counting. So we never want to spend an exorbitant amount of time and money for staff in order to fix a small discrepancy in double counting. We would prefer that you take a comprehensive approach and view, but try to mitigate that when you can. Next slide, please. So this should be intuitive, I hope, for everyone, but when I'm looking at an IPTT and a technical narrative from a partner, what I'm looking for is that targets are achievable and realistic, but also ambitious, that they're timely, and by that I mean, given the design, like I'll read the technical design and then read the IPTT by year and for LOA, and I want those things to match up. And if I'm reviewing a prep or the annual budget request, I'm looking at the DIP, which is the planned activities, to see if what we anticipate in terms of outputs and outcomes make sense, and do those things line up? Are the targets specific? Do they include those appropriate disaggregations? and are they calculated correctly? So for example, summing disaggregates correctly together, or drawing on past actuals and out year targets, not just past targets and out year targets. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite slides because it has goats in it. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. So this is a quick question. So I'll invite you to either chat or raise your hand. Would someone be able to explain the difference between percent and percentage point, which is a subtle nuance that's very important when we're thinking about target setting? And James, that's a great question that I'd love Killian and Justin, maybe we can spend some time discussing that at the end when we close after this next slide. But quickly, can someone explain the difference between percent and percentage point?
Can I jump?
Yes, please.
Thank you. So I don't know, yes, here is a picture. This is maybe in the foreground, if you consider this is the baseline or year 1, and maybe the 6th goat is year 2. So it's mean is increase out of 4 is 2 is a 50% increase here. Okay,
For which
so it was 4, but now it is 6. Okay, so that means within the 4 it increased 50%, 2 increased. Great. Okay, 50%. And right side I see it is also okay, it was 20% and then now it is 70%. So it's a 50 percentage point changes.
Great. I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much for that explanation. And we have Dan here explaining the difference similarly. So great. Thank you. So yes, we can see that there's been a 50% increase from 4 to 6 goats. We don't necessarily know the time period. It doesn't matter. And then by contrast, we see from 20% to 70% is a 50 percentage point increase. So the reason why I'm including this slide is it's very important when we are thinking about establishing targets for us to be clear in what type of target we're setting. And that should come across clearly in the IPTT and in the narrative. And also as partners are submitting and preparing and submitting reports, what I often see is use of the term percent when in fact they actually mean percentage point. And as you can see, they're dramatically different. So just to do a quick test of this, go ahead to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is a pop quiz. It should be pulling up on your screen now. So if Mescaram had 10 chickens last year and 20 this year, she has what percent more chickens now? Great, okay, can we go ahead and show the results then? Excellent, so pretty much everyone got this correct, that's great. And then you can click next on the slide, please. Yes, so how we determine percent is the second value minus the first value divided by the first value times 100, and that lets us have the percent. So in this case, it was 20 this year minus 10 from last year divided by 10. So we see 100% change. So great job. Almost everyone got that correct for those who did do the poll. So congratulations. And then let's go to head to the next slide. So I'll let you read that one. Great. Okay, we'll go ahead and end the poll now. So there's the results. So yes, congratulations. Most people got this correct. And go ahead to the next slide, please. Here. So in this case, to determine percentage point, we're going to take 20% minus 10%, and that gives us 10 percentage points. So again, it's really, oh, there's the results. Sorry about that. So it's really important for us to sort of think about the difference between these two concepts. And I love, someone said to me recently about writing, write what you mean and mean what you write, or say what you mean and say what you write. And so this is an example of that being a very important consideration when we are thinking about setting targets and reporting against them going forward. We really want to be sure that we're using the right terminology because they mean two different things. So go ahead to the next slide, please. And so great, we're right on schedule. So I'd like to turn the presentation over to Justin and or Killian to go ahead and do our wrap up today and take a look forward to tomorrow. So I wanna also, before I do that, thank everyone so much for your great comments during the chat and on audio. Thanks to those of you brave people who went off mute. And I look forward to continuing the discussion with you all. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you so much, Diana, for the presentation. How is everyone feeling? Just write a yes if this is something that brought to home the whole concept of target setting and the framework that informs it. If you are feeling a little bit overwhelmed with the content, if you're feeling a little bit confused, let's see in the chat box how you're feeling now after this delivery. Oh, yeah, okay. We have a poll for that. So please take a few seconds to just give us a bit of feedback in terms of how you're feeling now after an hour of this delivery. Okay, let's see the results and see how people are feeling. Okay, lots of people are feeling informed, which is good. Empowered, that's really good. And you've got people that are really feeling great about the presentation. We also have others that are still a bit confused or overwhelmed with the content. And are there specific, for those that have indicated that they're still a little bit confused, are there any specific areas that you might want to ask Diana to explain more or to provide more clarity? Please write in the chat box if there are areas that you think we need to go through again, provide more detail, as well as make sure that we don't leave anyone behind. Just indicate that in the chat box. Anyway, so thank you so much for the active participation, and it was actually good to see lots of information in the chat box indicating that people were engaged. I've been asked to just do a summary of today and highlight the key takeaways from today, as well as whet your appetite for what is going to come tomorrow. So what Diana literally did was to lay down the foundation, the conceptual framework for target setting. We know that it's an area that is a challenge, and we are trying to avoid thumb sucking of targets by providing a conceptual framework that everyone can use for setting targets. And this is a framework from Diana's presentation that really emphasizes the need for targets that are well informed, so that we really uphold issues around accountability, issues around creating benchmarks for performance assessment, as well as using those targets to adaptively manage our activities. So it was actually good to have that laid down, that framework laid down. What the presentation also tried to really highlight is what we need to be to consider when we are coming up with these targets. The first point that the presentation really highlighted is the nexus between participant and population level targets.
the importance of understanding what is happening at population level, what are we able to influence based on the level of targets that we have set at participant level. And we went through the standing example to just demonstrate that nexus. The other point that is also very important from the presentation is the fact that target setting has to be grounded in program theory. And we need to really understand the causal model. We need to understand each of the indicators that we are trying to set targets for, at what level is it in the causal chain. And I like the fact that Diana really highlighted the need to have a much wider view and making sure that the way we are setting targets is really informed by program theory. So in the exercise that we did looking at what we would need to monitor malnutrition in children, we could see that people had a bit of a narrow view in terms of what has to be done, and the emphasis is that make sure that we have a wider view. You have a wider view, and the way you are conceptualizing it is really informed by the theory of change that you have and the different components or factors that influence the indicator that you are looking at. The presentation also highlighted the fact that there are a couple of opportunities in the DFSA life cycle where we have opportunities to revisit the targets and revise them based on the evidence that we are generating, the contextual monitoring that we are doing, and using that information, revisit those targets to make sure that they are ambitious enough and will lead towards the change that we are expecting at population level. That led to a very good summation of why it's important to have realistic and ambitious participant targets. The need to make sure that we have these targets set at the right magnitude to achieve the required population level effects, the need to understand secondary adoption, and the importance of contextual monitoring and qualitative monitoring that provides us with the information and evidence of what is happening in the context in which we are operating, and that gives us a very good understanding of what we are likely to achieve with our population level indicators. There was also additional information in terms of the life of our targets, how to compute them, and how the importance of disaggregations, the issue of non-cumulative indicators, and how you can sum them up to come up with the life of award targets. So it's been intense. It's been good. And I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. Just another encouragement to drop any areas that are still gray that you think we need to respond to, as well as areas that you think we might that we can put in the parking lot for us to be able to have a much more deeper discussion, maybe tomorrow towards the end of our session. So that's a summary of what was presented today, and three important things: the conceptual framework for target setting, why are we doing it, the need to ground everything in the program theory, understanding secondary adoption, and making sure that once we understand secondary adoption, we are able to set those targets at the right level. There is a question that was asked in the chat. I'm just trying to go back to that question. I think it's James who asked that question. It's an important question. He asked whether, okay, ideally you will set targets for the different, sorry, I'm reading the response. I want to get to the actual question. Right. So James's question relates to the fact that we have activities in different districts that will that might have a very different operational context. And his question is that what would you suggest if we are working in multiple districts and the base value differs significantly between the operational areas or districts? How would you set targets for the project in this case? So ideally, James, like what was indicated by Justin in the chat box there, you would want to set targets for the different areas, given how the magnitude of those differences, to make sure that the targets are realistic given the context. In some cases, you might want to take an average of the different yields to come up with one average that you can then track against. But I think the important thing is that we are taking into account the differences that we see in the two areas, and how that difference informs the level at which we set our target, so that it's not unachievable for the other area, given the fact that maybe the yield that we end up setting might be too high. I think Diana gave an example of an experience in DRC where the national average yield was way too high compared to the localized yield for the area that was targeted. I don't see any other question in the chat. Okay, so maybe it's important to move to what we have lined up for tomorrow. So the plan tomorrow is that we finish off this laying down the conceptual framework for target setting. And then we move into a session where we actually then use our understanding and this framework that has been laid down to look at specific case studies. We have selected two case studies for tomorrow. The first case study focuses on agriculture, and we tried to create to simulate exactly what you face in the field, so that we really become practical about the realities that are there in the field when you're setting targets. The case studies have been dropped in the chat box. Please feel free to pick those up and have a chance to read them tonight in preparation for tomorrow. The second case study looks at wash and nutrition. Again, have a chance to read it tonight and then come prepared tomorrow to really then apply this learning that we are providing, so that you will be able to do those case studies. Right. Then lastly, we also wanted to just make sure that we have got a group photo. Unless if there are any other questions, I don't see any other questions in the chat box. We want to take a group photo. Lloyd, can you assist in terms of this group photo?
Sure. So no, it's just telling everybody in preparation for tomorrow. At the end of the day, we're gonna turn on the gallery view. We're all gonna smile big and take a couple screenshots. So we just wanted folks for tomorrow to make sure that maybe maybe they want to do their hair or wear a shirt or something, but we would love to do a group photo, but that's tomorrow. We're just letting everybody know a day in advance.
Okay, thanks for that clarification, Lloyd. So please come wearing your suit tomorrow for the gallery photo. Anything else from the team members about tomorrow? Did I leave anything out? Lloyd, Diana, I know Justin wanted to be excused early. Anyone from the team? Anything else, or we are done?
Well, just that the Google document contains everything they'll need. So that www.ideal.events/target. The links to the case studies are in there. If they want to provide any feedback on today in there, that's all provided confidentially. So their name is not linked to anything they write in there. So we encourage them to use that. And from Ideal's end, I'll hand it over to you and Diana to just close it and say goodbye. Thanks, everyone.
Right. Thank you, Lloyd. So thank you, everyone, for the active participation today. We look forward to tomorrow, and we hope that tomorrow will be as productive as was today. If there's any specific area that you really want us to go through again tomorrow to improve your understanding, please let us know, and we will do our best to try and make sure that the concepts are well explained. So thank you to the Ideal team. Thank you to Diana. Thank you to everyone for the great participation. See you tomorrow.